All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying for this panel on fiscal reform in California. My name is Sarah Bohn. I'm the Vice President of Policy Research at the Public Policy Institute of California, and I have the pleasure of moderating a discussion with these three bright minds today on tax policy, public pensions, and the unemployment insurance system in California. And we hope in this 50 minutes or so to arrive at some solutions to these major problems. Or, if that's too optimistic, we at least hope to come to a more shared understanding of, one, the importance of these issues, which can often be very dry, but they're critically important for the future of California. And two, have a discussion around what can be done. What are the most critical reforms that need to take place, or the most doable ones? So I'm going to start by introducing these three folks. They're going to give a few minutes of remarks. We're going to have a discussion, and we'll also open it up to questions from you. So please keep your thinking and curious caps on as you're listening. So first, Irena Asmundson is a research scholar at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. She's the managing director of SIEPR's California Policy Research Initiative, or CAPRI. Prior to SIEPR, Dr. Asmundson served as the chief economist of the Department of Finance for the state of California, where she directed periodic, really often regular, revenue and economic forecasts. She has also served as an economist at the International Monetary Fund, covering global macroeconomic policy issues. So our California native economist, trained first here at Stanford, also brings that global perspective to our little slice of the world here in California. Mark Duggan is the Trione director of SIEPR, as you know. He made the leap from electrical engineering to economics, and we're all lucky for it. Prior to Stanford, Mark taught at the University of Pennsylvania, and most importantly, at the University of Maryland, where he was my economics professor. And Mark's Thank you, Mark. Mark's work focuses on the effects of government expenditures and major programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and now UI on the behavior of individuals, firms, and behavior in the labor market. And last but not least is Josh Rowe. He's the Ormond Family Professor of Finance at Stanford's Graduate School of Business and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He formerly served on the President's Council of Economic Advisors and taught at University of Chicago and Northwestern and served as an economist at Goldman Sachs. He studies government pension liabilities, corporate investment and business taxation, among other things. And I think he's the only one on our panel that has a YouTube video with over 3 million views. Sorry, Irena and Mark. Tough competition. A video on public pensions and economic time bomb, which foreshadows, I think, a bit of the comments he's going to share with us now. So I'm going to turn it over to these three, and then we'll have a discussion after their initial remarks. So Josh, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction. It turns out that Mark was also my professor as well. When Mark was visiting MIT, no nepotism here. When Mark was visiting MIT from the University of Maryland, I was a first-year graduate student taking public finance, and so Mark taught me most of what I know. So thanks, Mark, and it's great to be here. Okay, so I have the pleasure of talking about pensions, which some people think of as being kind of a dry topic, but I really like it, and I also think it's very, very important. So I want to just say a few words about the basics of pensions in California, where we are and what the issues are. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the design of retirement benefits for public employees versus those in the private sector. And then I'm going to end with a few comments on asset allocation and governance and try to do it in all under 5 minutes. So could be tough, but I'm going to see what I can do. So just the basics. This is a question about how do public employees in California receive retirement benefits. Most people in the private sector are familiar with a 401k kind of model where you work and you receive contributions from your employer, and maybe you provide some tax-deferred contributions into the fund. Public employees are, of course, in a defined benefit pension system. This is a more traditional retirement benefit where they work for a certain number of years. They accrue rights to a pension that they're going to receive, a monthly check they're going to receive when they retire, and then they receive that from the government when they retire. So the fundamental economics behind this is that when the state promises a pension to an employee, they're creating a liability for themselves, for the state or for the local government. Basically, you could imagine, instead of borrowing from the capital markets, I'm going to borrow from my employee. I'm going to promise to pay my employee later instead of paying them more today. Now, fortunately, they don't just stop there. They set money aside in pension funds. So the biggest state pension funds are CalPERS, California Public Employee Retirement System, CalSTRS, which is for state teachers, for teachers in California, and the University of California Retirement Plan are massive funds. Together, these funds have about $800 billion of assets in them, about $850. CalPERS currently has about $455 billion. They're the biggest. That's an estimate as of April 2022, down from about $477 billion in June 2021. One of the big policy choices that gets made around pensions is what's called the discount rate. Discount rate is the assumption that pension plans make, that the boards of these pension funds make, about how much return to assume on their pension assets. More you assume today, the less you got to set aside today, or the less you think you have to set aside today, because you're assuming a high return going forward for the future. One of the big phenomena that's been going on here, and one of the big sort of underlying points that I want to make, is that CalPERS has been progressively lowering this expected rate of return, lowering this discount rate. And it is now to the point where it is at 6.8% assumption, year-on-year assumed return, from 7.5% previously. So whether the amount of money in the fund is going to be sufficient to pay pensions, or really how much more we're going to have to put in, is going to be a function of how well the assets in the fund perform. And if you look at the past returns of CalPERS, they've been pretty volatile. Though largely they've actually historically, over the period that we've looked at, these last say 30 years, you can even look over a longer period of time, have largely met the assumed investment returns that they've had. Over a 10-year horizon, CalPERS has achieved 8.5% annualized returns. Over 20 years, 6.9%. Over 30 years, 8.4%. So what could possibly be wrong with continuing to assume that these returns are going to happen going forward in the future? Well, the problem is that there's no guarantee that those returns are going to be earned, but there is a guarantee that we're going to pay these pensions. And so CalPERS, the board, to their credit, has been reducing the discount rate, the assumption about what these assets are going to return. Of course, that's also creating a real pinch for local governments in California and for the state government. So one of the groups of participants in CalPERS are local governments that participate in CalPERS. They're called the agency plans. And so essentially the way you can think about it is that CalPERS sends the city that's participating in this plan for their employees a bill each year. And those bills have gone up a lot. So right now for employees in Perf C, which are basically small cities and towns, the bill is 44% of pay. That's what a small city or town in California that participates in CalPERS has to contribute. 44% of the payroll of their employees, CalPERS calls up and says, you owe us 44% this year. That's a lot. That's up from 23% about 10 years ago. CalSTRS, the teachers, similar thing, wasn't achieved so much through the discount rate, but rather through legislation in 2014. So basically, there's a much bigger burden now on local governments, on school districts to contribute into these pension funds, because we realized, hey, we're actually behind and we're making assumptions that are too aggressive. So that's a difficulty. And what it means is that altogether there are many, many hundreds of billions of dollars of unfunded liabilities, effectively government debt, that is not really explicitly recognized on balance sheets. If you look at all these state plans together, about $300 billion was reported of unfunded debts, unfunded liabilities, so a gap between what they have and what they need. But if you actually measure it using economic standards that are used by the Federal Reserve and others, it's $990 billion, so almost $1 trillion of unfunded debts. So challenge number one is the money's going to have to come from somewhere. Challenge number two is, what about this design of benefits? This is a defined benefit plan. This is, if you're going to work for the state for your whole career, this is a great plan. You accrue benefits over your lifetime, and the benefit that you accrue between year 30 and or years 25 and 30 is bigger than the benefit you accrue between years 20 and 25. If you're going to work for the state for 30 years, this is a great plan. Labor markets have changed, though, and not everyone is interested in working for the state for a really long time. If you work for the state or your local government only for a relatively short period of time, then you don't actually accrue that much in the way of benefits. And so for people who are only going to work, maybe they're going to teach in California, teachers going to teach in California for 5 years and then move someplace else, or go to another state, or get a graduate degree, they may walk out of that not actually accruing any retirement benefits. And that's kind of, it's not clear that that's the right structure that we want to have. Also on costs, there's been some legislation to try to address costs. There was something called PPRA in 2013, which estimated to save about $20 billion. Well, okay, $20 billion is good, but out of $990 billion, we have a long way to go. We did have a surplus that by some measures was $98 billion this year. I didn't see any discussion about wanting to try to use some of it to shore up these pension funds. It's not very politically popular to do that. The politicians want to say, well, we did this with the money, we did that with the money. Saying we paid money towards an unfunded debt just doesn't sound that sexy. So often it tends not to be done, and which is one of the reasons I think that things get kicked down the road. Last thing I'll just say is this question of asset allocation and governance. A $990 billion deficit on funds that themselves, assets of $850 billion. It's a big strategy to think about how are you going to invest that money. It's a big challenge, a big investment challenge. And there's a big governance challenge too. The CalPERS board has 6 members who are elected from the participants at large, 3 who are governmental appointees, one of which must include an elected local official and one of which must include a life insurance executive, and 4 ex officio members. I believe that, and my research shows that independent directors do much better. We need more independent directors in the board of CalPERS. They can be appointees, but they should be people with lots of investment experience. Not all bad, some good things, some good developments. The new CIO of CalPERS, Nicole Musico, has been given a compensation package that is a pay-for-performance package. And it's received some criticism from people because of the amount of money she could make if the fund does well. She could make up to $2.8 million in a year if the fund does well. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. She's managing a fund that is a $450 billion fund. If you manage that well for the state of California, then you actually deserve a good take-home pay. I'm going to end there. I'd love to talk also at some point about the different objectives that pension funds have. Obviously, they have an objective to maximize risk-adjusted returns. Increasingly, they also have objectives that are non-financial, that are related to environmental, social, and governance objectives, ESG, or other social objectives. But I'm out of time, so we'll have to just talk about that in the discussion.
Continuing on the topic of really, really interesting topics, I'm going to talk about taxes. California likes to think of itself as a progressive state. We like to think of ourselves as very innovative. We support the next generation of innovators. We invest in education. A budget is the ultimate expression of values, and taxes in particular is the ultimate expression of values because that's where we have to pay for things. So California has a number of structural factors in its tax system, as gone over by Patrick's report, that make it very clear that we actually care more about keeping rich people rich than we do about any other policy priority. Prop 13, in particular, was the one that capped the assessed value of property taxes. Property taxes are the most stable and the most correlated with the needs of fiscal spending tax that you can find, and they have been undercut over time, over the 40 years that Prop 13 has been in place. The 2/3 requirement for raising new taxes also undercuts democracy by making it so that a small committed minority can block collective action. It can block the collective action of, we want to do something good, we are going to tax ourselves, but if you can't get that 2/3 majority, then that gets blocked. So those are the structural factors that face California. And the other thing working against sort of progress in this area is that people don't seem to understand the drama that comes from taxes. Like, taxes are really interesting. Taxes drive all sorts of things. But whenever I try and tell people this, their eyes sort of glaze over. I do see some eyes glazing over in the audience. You guys should get the drama of taxes. Here. Yeah. Pensions also tend to make people's eyes glaze over. Demography also tends to make people's eyes glaze over, but demography is sort of central to what's happening in our state. One of the things that we also worry about, in addition to all of the things that Josh touched on for the pensions, is the changing demographic structure of California, which means that, when a lot of these pension systems were set up, and under the California rule, you can't renegotiate pension deals. So a lot of the locals assumed that they would have growing populations forever. And so if you have a growing population and you have a pay-as-you-go pension system, then in the future, then you don't have to pay as much right now, and you're going to get future people paying in more. Well, what happens when that reverses and you start having a shrinking population? That becomes a very difficult situation. You know, you go from 23% of your wage bill having to go to pensions to 44%. Normally, you would want a sort of tax system that would adjust for that. You would want an automatic adjuster where you get more in revenues when you need to spend more. Usually that comes through property taxes, because if the value of your property goes up, then, and more people want to be in your area, then normally what you would get would be larger property taxes. We don't get that in California. And so there's this mismatch between the sources of revenue that we are getting and what we need to be spending money on to continue investing in education, to continue investing in infrastructure, to continue investing in that innovative spirit. So those are some of the structural issues in taxes in California. Other things that also feed into this, there's a number of smaller things about the structural system of taxes in California that I wanted to mention. One is the state appropriations limit, which means that, so a lot of people are talking about universal basic income, you know, that's having a moment. To do universal basic income, that's basically, you tax a whole bunch of people and you redistribute the money, and then people have sort of like this stable source of income, and then they can spend their time doing innovative things. Like there's just a little bit more certainty in life. This is a lovely idea. I would love to see this implemented. How are you going to pay for that? In California, there is a limit on the amount of taxes that you can collect, which is called the state appropriations limit. The state is actually bumping up against that. And the way the rules are, it says you're going to have to return that money to people, and you can't do it through universal basic income. So, you know, you can't do this tax and redistribute in California to the same extent that our economy is sort of going. We have this very innovative economy that has huge returns to a few, and we do get some of those returns through capital gains taxes and through our progressive taxation, but it's not enough to be an automatic adjuster. Our tax system is not set up to be that automatic adjuster between what we need and what we need to collect. So there's lots of interesting issues here. I will say, for you students out there or for you researchers out there, this is an area that is really under-researched. And so if you want to do good for the world, if you want to help move the needle on our collective action, on us having an innovative economy that includes everyone, work on taxes. All right, I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. You're stuck with me again. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes and then we'll get to a discussion. I'm talking about even more. Yeah, it's hard to get more riveting than public pensions and taxes, but now we're going to talk about unemployment insurance. So unemployment insurance is probably the most well-known safety net program and basically automatic stabilizer that economists refer to. When the economy tanks, unemployment insurance tends to surge. A lot more people go on to unemployment insurance. Sort of like food stamps. It's been around since 1935 at the federal level, and it's a very important safety net program that attracted a huge amount of attention during the most recent recession because it was tweaked in many ways, including enhanced benefits to the tune of $600 extra a week for everybody who was on the program. Since its inception, each state has been pretty much free to design its own unemployment insurance program, though has some flexibility. There are some constraints on that, but both on the benefit side, how generous are the benefits that people will get if they become unemployed and qualify for unemployment insurance, and how will we finance it? So it is a standalone system, which is to say there are taxes that are used to finance unemployment insurance benefits. And the idea is to build up a trust fund when times are good, a lot of tax revenue then, and then to draw down perhaps that trust fund when times are not so good, when tax revenues fall, when the economy tanks, when benefits rise, more people are unemployed. And there's a lot of variation across states with respect to both the benefits and the financing. Your typical state has what is called a 50% replacement rate, which is to say if you get laid off and you qualify for unemployment insurance, you collect 50% of your earnings up to a benefit maximum. And that benefit maximum varies a lot. It is $450 a week in California. It's $250 in Florida. It's $795 in the state of Washington. So it varies a lot across states, that weekly benefit maximum. But that 50% replacement rate is pretty much a feature of all places. And they look at your earnings over the last year or two in calculating in terms of that. And virtually all of the research on unemployment insurance, virtually all of the discussion of unemployment insurance in the popular press or by policymakers focuses on the benefit side. Pretty much everything. And that happened in the most recent, over the last 2.5 years. We heard a lot of calls for finance giving more generous unemployment insurance benefits. That was the $600 extra a week. And people wanted to actually make, instead of doing the $600 extra a week, to make the replacement rates like 75, 80, or 100%. But as remarkable as it may seem, the systems that manage unemployment insurance were incapable of doing that. In California, too, California could not have done that. Just to give it, and I still, it remains a bit of a mystery to me, but they, apparently we were incapable of that fix. So everyone got $600 extra a week. And so a lot of people worried that if you were, let's say, getting $200 a week because you had been working at $400 a week, and now you got an extra $600, maybe you wouldn't want to work anytime soon. So that was, that's something that was talked about and was explored a bit. So that is the benefits. I want to talk a little bit about the financing side of things because that receives zero attention. The way that the taxes are paid, we never see them as workers. Employers pay them on our behalf. So there are employer-paid payroll taxes that are invisible to workers, but definitely affect what workers earn because they affect the cost to each employer of hiring a worker. And they are experience rated, which is to say if you are a company that consistently lays off a lot of workers, you pay higher unemployment insurance tax rates than if you're a company that never lays anyone off, okay? Which has one not so great feature, which is that tax rates rise typically just as the economy is starting to come out, trying to recover. So if you think about it, unemployment surges, a lot of companies' tax rates go up, and I think it kicks a bunch of employers, especially employers not Stanford University, not Google, not Apple, but like employers where they're hiring workers at, let's say, minimum wage or in, let's say, food, lower wage workers, it kicks a lot of firms potentially out of business because it basically kicks them when they're down, so to speak. But another issue that has received pretty much no attention is the tax base. Like, what are the amount of earnings that are subject to unemployment insurance taxes? And it turns out that in the state of Washington, to take one example, the employer tax base is $66,000, which is to say the employer pays taxes on a worker's first $66,000 in earnings and nothing beyond that. And that has been indexed to inflation so that each year for the last 39 years it's gone up 2 or 3% a year with earnings. In California, the tax base for unemployment insurance is the lowest in the country. It is $7,000. So $7,000 annual, and it has been there for 39 years. And it's like every time I look at this, I kind of can't believe it, but it's true. 39 years, and so it is the case that, and it's interesting because it ends up with some very bizarre things. Like, for example, suppose an employer has 2 workers. One worker earns $7,000 a year, the other earns $42,000 a year. They pay the same unemployment insurance taxes for those 2 workers. If they lay off the 2 workers, so their contributions to the system are identical. And yet, if they lay off both workers, the $42,000 a year worker gets 6 times the unemployment insurance benefit that the $7,000 a year worker gets, which is kind of, it's kind of remarkable to me that this is true, and and so you would think that that would energize some people, like, wow, this is not great, especially for low-income workers. I guess it's great for me. I'm earning more than $7,000 a year. I'm happy that that's true, but we basically are giving kind of free insurance to higher income people. And so, but also a consequence of that, so it's highly regressive relative to, let's say, the state of Washington system, which has this $66,000 tax base. But another problem is that the financing of the program is deeply inadequate. So in February 2020, a month before COVID hit, the US Department of Labor, as it does every year, ranked unemployment insurance programs with respect to their solvency from 1 to 52, with Puerto Rico included in there as well. And California was ranked not 1, not 7, not 15, 52. We were 52nd out of 52. We were the least well-funded. We had just barely gotten back into balance after the Great Recession 10 years earlier because we have no tax base for the program. So now, and what does that mean? If we had no trust fund before COVID, and then we had this giant recession and we had to pay unemployment insurance benefits, what happened? The California state government borrowed from the federal government. And so you worry about the federal debt. Federal government actually also lends money. So we currently have a $17.6 billion debt to the federal government. And we're one of only 6 states to have such a debt. And we're the highest in per capita terms. And it kind of makes me sad because I'm like a fiscally responsible, I worked for Obama, I'm a fiscally responsible Democrat, but it makes me sad that my state doesn't really want to tackle this problem. And it's a pretty simple fix, $7,000 tax base. Maybe it made sense in 1983. Probably doesn't make sense in 2023. So, and it should have bipartisan support, I think. Fiscally responsible, more conservative people should get behind, like, we don't want to run persistent deficits, have this huge debt, $17.5 billion, which we do have a surplus that's a lot bigger than that right now, so we could pay that off like that, but it's more fun to do other stuff than pay off the UI debt. And it would help disadvantaged workers differentially, because what it would do if you expand the tax base, so in public economics, my advisor, Marty Feldstein, who was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for Ronald Reagan back in the 1980s, used to talk a lot about broaden the base, lower the rates. And that's what you can do. If we broaden the $7,000 base, we can lower the rates so that this would have a lot of good features. But in any case, this is a topic that energizes me a lot, as people know. And I've been trying to talk with people, and I can't seem to get, it's not really an issue that is all that fun. So it doesn't seem to, I've talked with a number of legislators, so if anyone has any ideas, but we're going to talk about it. Maybe we'll solve it. I do have an easy solution. Raise it above $7,000. That would be a start. Anyway, okay, I'll stop there.
Well, I think we're really living into the dismal scientist.
Yeah, all right, I'm sorry.
So I'm gonna try to take us in a couple directions, and then again want to invite questions from the audience. First, I want to ask you all about who's impact if we continue to kick these problems down the road, and then I'm going to ask about kind of what a better system would look like in each of your areas. So trying to kind of maybe take this a little less out of dismal territory, perhaps. We'll see. So question for all 3 of you would be, who, and you spoke to it a bit, each of you, but I'd like to hear again, and maybe you can elaborate on, who is most affected by the problems that you articulated? Who would be most affected, whether it's people, firms, in the state, if we continue to kind of kick these problems down the road? And I'd invite you to kind of respond at will, and maybe we can generate more of a discussion as well.
Maybe we would go in the order.
All right. Well, I would say on pensions, I mean, I think that like the children of California are pretty clearly highly impacted. If a school district has to spend increasing percentages of their revenue on past unfunded pension liabilities and past legacy retiree health insurance, and a lot of the increase in spending for school districts has been on that, then you end up having a situation where the actual people who are supposed to benefit from the public services, the kids who are going to the schools, aren't benefiting from that additional spending. So, there are different statistics thrown around for the number of thousands of dollars per student that the California public schools spend. And there's been a big increase in that over time. Big chunk of that increase has been increases in contributions to CalSTRS for unfunded pension liabilities and contributions to retiree health, which is like a sort of bad brother of the pension problem, if you will. It's like another pension problem that's not as big in magnitude, but still very big. So it's anybody who relies. That's just an example. It's anybody who relies on public services, because the more and more tax dollars we have are just going to go to this bigger and bigger hole. And the longer we wait to address the hole, the bigger the amount has to be that we contribute to deal with it.
So my answer about who is mostly affected is, of course, it's easier to be mean to poor people. It's easier to be mean to people who aren't voters, kids, for example, even though parents vote. And so, this is one of those issues where it's very much whoever has the money who doesn't want to pay the taxes, who then contributes to policymakers, to campaigns. They're the ones who are blocking it. Mark keeps on being surprised that the legislature doesn't want to take a 2/3 vote to raise taxes, but that is how they think about it.
What taxes do I want? Only unemployment insurance.
Only unemployment insurance, which would be fiscally responsible, and I'm totally on your side, and we wrote that policy brief that I hope lots of people read, but there is a very big reluctance to take on a 2/3 vote. And so, if it's the future innovators. It's the people that we would want to start the next billion-dollar company. They're the ones who are not being invested in. And we all lose because of that.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up before I let Mark weigh in on this? And that is, to what extent do the smart reforms in the tax arena affect who comes to California, who lives here, who can stay here? What's your take on that question that's on a lot of people's minds?
This is a really hard one, because we do have a very high top tax rate. And so there is this discouragement factor if you already have money. That is sort of outweighed by the fact that California is also a great place to start a company right now, because it's easy to find very educated people. That's not always going to be true forever. The previous panel talked about that. So it's bad for the people who are rich right now, and it's bad for the people who might be rich that we could get taxes from in the future.
Yeah, just generally, I just worry California is a little bit resting on our laurels a little bit and doesn't feel a need to be at all strategic or competitive. That's part of the reason. I don't know if some of you came, but we had this, it was virtual policy forum in the fall about California versus Texas, two completely different economic policy models. And let's hammer it out, who's doing it better. So California's got this gigantic 13.3% top rate, Texas no individual income tax rate. California spends $17,000 a year per state resident, state and local spending. Texas 10, and minimum wage 15, no minimum wage in Texas, so it's 725. Completely different economic models. And I do wish California, and I wish this was true of every state in the U.S., looked more to our other states and said, okay, can we learn something from these other places? So I think on tax policy, Prop 13 is near and dear to my heart. My neighbor, I moved into my house a few years ago. My neighbor's house is bigger, nicer, bigger yard, and pays 1/9 of the property tax that I do. So it's kind of ridiculous, but he's very happy. He's really, I see every time I see him, so he's happy. That's something. That counts for something. So, but I'll just say on the unemployment insurance thing, I think that it's rounding error to the software engineers, to me, to lawyers, doctors, to accountants, the fix that I'm talking about. I think it would make a big difference to people who work, let's say, in fast food establishments. Why would that be? Just basically, right now, you have a lot of people who are struggling or working 2 or 3 different part-time jobs who are, then they're paying this unemployment insurance tax through multiple employers. And the cost to hiring them has to be higher. You mechanically need a higher rate across the board if you're going to have this tiny tax base. And so I think it is terrible for the most vulnerable workers in the economy. If you did the kind of fix that I'm proposing, or even and that Irena and I were proposing, or even just go in that general direction, it's rounding error for most people who are middle income or above, and you could design it surgically in a way that it would be minimal, any effect. So I think Washington State is doing well on unemployment insurance. Whenever I mention Washington State, though, with people who live in California and have money, they sort of look out the window and think about, wow, they have a really good individual income tax there too.
0.
Which is 0. That is, so maybe, I don't know that we don't have the luxury of mimicking them on that because of Prop 13 and other stuff. So anyway.
But Mark, aren't you proposing a revenue neutral solution?
Yeah, I'm proposing it.
So what's the explanation for the opposition to that then, if it's revenue neutral?
it just require. I mean, it's just not. It's not very fun. It's like it's much more. I think right now, if you're, I think it's there is. I do think there are some. There isn't a powerful group behind it. You know, $17.5 billion in debt to the federal government that we have. So if you add up the debt of all other 49 states, DC and Puerto Rico, it's about half of California's debt.
Can I actually interject something here? It's not actually revenue neutral. It saves us money because the general fund has to pay for the interest costs to the federal government on that debt. Employers do not pay that because the trust fund is not allowed to pay for that. And so by bringing that forward and by having those interest costs go away, then we would actually, like as a state, save money.
Right.
But again, it would be this 2/3 vote, which makes it very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it would be good to have a little more revenues into the system because we were dead last with respect to fiscal health before. So we should have a little more in revenue. Maybe we shouldn't have a $450 a week weekly benefit max. I mean, I would like it if in California or the country there was more discussion of big government, smaller government. Like, you know what I mean? So maybe we should bring $450 down to $350. Save money, you could have lower taxes, pluses and minuses of that, but we can't really have that kind of a conversation for the reasons that were mentioned in the first panel. It just gets into some alternate universe discussion. But you could have that discussion. Maybe we should follow the Florida approach, $250 a week benefit maximum. I'm not advocating for that. I'm definitely not. But you could have that discussion of maybe that's the way we should make the program more fiscally healthy, not getting a little more tax revenue. Because I think being dead last on anything, California doesn't want to be dead last on anything. But we were decidedly dead last. We did beat, I will say, for those of you who are worried, we did beat the Virgin Islands. We were ahead of the they do rank 53, so we were we were 52 out of 53.
What's that interest rate? Because maybe that's the state has tons of debts and unfunded liabilities. Maybe that's the cheapest source of borrowing for us from the federal government.
What do you think, Irena?
It is the cheapest source
2%?
of. It's very low. It will be going up, and again, because the general fund has to pay for that, then California was trying to do this sort of smoothing out the peaks and the valleys. So we had this massive reserve fund that we tried to protect for rainy days or droughts, which would have been more appropriate in California. But so, you know, by allowing ourselves to run this debt and not fixing this structural problem, we are undercutting all of our fiscal responsibility in these other areas. That's probably hundreds of millions of dollars that we could be spending on something else, but we don't because we don't want to take the 2/3.
Yeah, but we don't. Yeah, so, but it is. Yeah, but it's pretty simple. It's like one number, right? As policy, like that. It's just that's it.
I mean, I think the income tax thing is more challenging. I have a different view of the income tax. I mean, I think the research pretty much shows that on the individual income tax, the top rate of 13.3%, we're almost tapped out on that one. I don't think you can keep raising that rate and expect to get a lot more revenue over the long term. You know, now that the state taxes are no longer deductible at the federal level, when that happened, we started seeing a net outflow of taxable income. Looking at the tax records that I analyze, net outflow of taxable income spiked up that year and began of $3.8 billion in the first year that SALT cap was in, because all of a sudden now there are more people leaving the state, more higher income people leaving the state, and that elimination of that federal tax deduction for state taxes really increased this. It increased the overall burden for a lot of people. It really increased the spread between what I pay in taxes if I live in California or another state. So on the overall individual income tax rate, I think I might have a bit of a different view from some people up here. I think we're tapped out on that one. I don't think the state's in a.
So you want to go? You think? I'm surprised that no one has written the editorial. I haven't seen it. Have you written the editorial yet of why? Like, we have a $100 billion surplus. Maybe the 13.3 should be lower.
Well, the Wall Street Journal wrote that editorial, and I mean, I guess I would just bring up a whole slew of questions about what the surplus could have gone to that have been raised all today, right? The rainy day fund, the unfunded pension obligations, the unemployment insurance gap. There's so many things, and instead, we're going to spend all of it, and we know that this revenue is incredibly volatile. So, but spending is what I think the people who are doing the spending think this is what's going to buy them political votes. And I'm not a politician. I haven't gotten elected for any office, and I don't think I ever will. So they may know something that I don't.
Irena, do you want to comment on what that one-time money can actually be used for?
So I will give the state government some credit.
As a former state government
as a former
employee.
state government
Got some
employee.
pals there.
In that, there has been this very strong cultural shift towards using one-time money for one-time purposes. And so at least we're not in this business of sort of like saying, okay, great, we get this one-time money, we're going to spend it on things that we're going to have to cut next year. So that is progress. But the ideal would be you use this one-time money on things that would change the structural issues in the future, that would fix some of these structural issues. One of the hardest points about these structural issues is that they are collective action problems that have gotten sort of like ossified in our culture and are really hard to unpick. And so how do you get out of these structural issues? You got to do some side payments. You got to say, okay, fine, if you vote for this, if you go along for this, we're going to sort of like make it easier for the next 5 years. That is what one-time money can be used for, and there's not a lot of that going on in Sacramento. So unemployment insurance, paying that down in return for, like raising the tax base, that would have been a great use of this. Paying down on some of this pension stuff in return for reforms that would have made it easier to do automatic stabilization, that would have been a great thing. We're not doing that. But it'll be nice that some people get some money.
We promised to open up for questions from the audience. I'm sure we could keep this going for a long time, so I wanted to give any of you an opportunity to get your 2 cents in here.
What percentage of the pension funds are?
Oh, sorry, there's a mic.
What percentage of the pension funds are invested in fossil fuels?
I don't know. It's a great question, and CalPERS and CalSTRS have been among the most active of the activist investors. So just to take an example, you probably read about the actions by the activist investor Engine One to remove board members of Chevron and to replace them with people who were going to shift the activities of Chevron more towards green energy production. CalPERS and CalSTRS were behind that. They also went even farther, and they supported the proposals of another group that wanted more extreme environmental action, and that was a group that was I think this follow-up proposal. That was a group that was not supported actually by the Engine One activist hedge fund. So I don't know. I think where you're going is this question of should, or the way I think about this question is to what extent should state and local government pension funds be engaging in activist ESG policy with this massive amount of money that they have. And I would just say I think there are big trade-offs there. I think there are big trade-offs in terms of returns. I think the definition of ESG is very slippery, and so there are trade-offs in terms of governance and giving over control. It seems like this year's ESG is very different from last year's ESG. And I also think there are issues of whether things that are being done really comport with public opinion. I'm going to cite a poll, National Gallup poll, says that the majority of Americans, 60% of Americans want there to be less use of fossil fuel in our energy mix. When you start asking them about specific sources, a lot of it is about coal. About 39% don't want to reduce the amount of oil in the energy mix, and only 19% want to reduce the amount of natural gas in the energy mix. Now, maybe in California, those poll numbers would be higher, but I think one has to be a little bit careful about assuming that the will of the people is just what we might think it is here.
Other questions? Karthik, microphone's coming.
So bottom line, in about 20 years, would you bet for California or against California when it comes to things like pension and our long-term fiscal future?
We all taking bets, or
Of course, we just go in the order we're supposed to.
the order we're supposed to go in?
Josh, you get to go first.
Why don't you answer that first, Josh?
Well, Mark, you were my professor, and I said that you taught me almost everything that I know. I left the almost in there just in case you disagree with me on something. You could say that part's not what I taught you. Well, I do think that there is a possibility. Look, we had a policy lab on homelessness actually that we just did at the GSB with some GSB students. We went up to Sacramento and talked to people in the legislature, and I actually I think I was I was pleasantly struck by the openness of people for good ideas. And I do think this is a state where people fundamentally are open to good ideas. I think there are some political challenges, there are some communications challenges, bet for or against. I guess the only thing I'll say is that, I'm still here. So in that sense, I guess I'm in with everybody else.
So there's only one law left in economics, which is if something can't go on, it will stop. And having started my career at the IMF, I really, really prefer something stopping in a measured, gradual, planned way rather than a hard stop and a crash. What I see in terms of the structural stuff and in terms of the tax policy, things are going to stop. So I think California is going to have to deal with it one way or the other. In the next 20 years, who knows if that hard stop will have happened at that point. I think California will recover. It's just how much pain do we have to go through?
Yeah, I guess I would say when I look at how incredibly the improvements in technology and the use of data have revolutionized the private sector over the last 25 years. It's kind of incredible when you think about all that that is possible for companies to do today, all that is available to us as consumers, and so forth today. And I sort of think that it is possible, and if not California, where possible / plausible that sort of revolution of using data, using evidence to make decisions, I think could be incredibly powerful in California. Because when I think about basically state and local government spending in California, depends exactly on how you cut it, it was about $700 billion. Okay, so that's about $17,500 per California state resident. And I think if that were targeted better, smarter, less sort of in a almost blindfolded way in terms of what is the actual evidence to support us doing this or that, I think it's incredible to imagine what could be possible. But I just think every day I view as like a missed opportunity we are not using data and evidence to drive what the government does. And it's been used to remarkable effect by the private sector, and that's why we've seen these big productivity gains. And we can talk, I think it's very reasonable to talk about inequalities growing and all this, but what we can do now relative to what we could do 25 years thanks to changes in the private sector is incredible. But in terms of government, it's barely, you can basically, I guess the biggest, this is, I'm sure we can come up with better examples, but now we don't have to stop at toll booths. That's an improvement, that's something. But I'm talking about like the big stuff. Criminal justice, education, healthcare, like that kind of stuff could be done much more surgically and smarter. And I think we could do it, but there's really no champion right now. And I think if there were a champion for that, anything would be possible. But if that doesn't happen, then I'm less optimistic.
Thank you, Karthik, for drawing the least dismal parts of us.
Yes.
And that's a wrap on this panel. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Okay, so next, I guess we do a few-minute transition. Is that right?
Okay, so can we check everyone's mic? Tina, can we check yours?
Testing.
Okay.
Testing.
Okay, great. So we'll start with you. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us for this third panel, which is titled intriguingly, California as a Foreign Policy Power. What we've learned today is California already has done things that are akin to what other nation states have done in terms of memoranda of understanding, agreements, especially on climate issues, encouraging foreign direct investment, entering into bilateral as well as multilateral conversations, if not agreements, on a host of issues. Today we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this notion of California. It's not a nation state, even though our governor has said that it's a nation state. I mean, we can't print our own money. We can't declare war. We can't restrict the entry of people from other states coming in or kick people out of our state. But short of that, it seems like there's a fair amount of things we could do. What we're hoping to do today is to have a smarter and deeper conversation. But what are the limits, given our current legal and constitutional framework, both at the federal level and at the state level, that we can push things? And then thinking ahead to the next 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. Where can California go? Today I'm joined by two distinguished panelists. Catherine Stoner, unfortunately, couldn't be with us here today. Gives us more time to dig into some of these questions. So first we have Bernadette Myler from the law school here at Stanford, who will help set the table in terms of the history of federalism and foreign policy, where California might find itself, right, in that larger sweep of what is possible in our legal and constitutional framework. Then we'll hear from Tina Cuellar, former professor here at Stanford, former state Supreme Court justice from the state of California, now the CEO or executive director?
President.
President and CEO.
President.
Just the president.
The 10th.
Simple. Of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and importantly is in the process of opening up a Carnegie California office, the first such subnational office for the endowment. Really exciting development. And we'll hear more about that and why the Carnegie Endowment has chosen California as a place to do this work. But first, let's hear from Bernie.
Great, so thanks so much for inviting me to be here. I'm really thrilled and delighted to be able to reconvene with Tito, who is an old friend. So I wanted to begin by setting the stage for how California can act on the international stage given constitutional possibilities and constitutional constraints. And there are really three parts to this constitutional dimension. The first is the extent of federal powers and the federal powers that preempt or kind of overrule California powers. The second is the explicit grants to states of immunities from the scope of federal powers. And then the third is specific disabilities in the Constitution given to states in acting in the foreign affairs arena or acting in ways that might allow them to league with other nations. So in terms of the federal powers that really can be used to trump or preempt state powers, there are a number derived from both Article 1, dealing with Congress, and Article 2, the presidency. With respect to Article 1, the main vehicles are really the commerce power and the power over foreign commerce. So Congress has a power to make laws pertaining to commerce and also to foreign commerce. And if these laws are validly passed, then they will preempt any contrary state law. And they're very complicated preemption doctrines that we don't have to get into, but the basic idea is that those federal laws will trump any kind of state action if it's overlapping. Now, on the presidential side, there's also the power to make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. And that power has meant that, in general, the treaty power is a federal power, and then there are also other kind of foreign affairs powers that are either expressed or implied between Articles 1 and 2. So the power to make war is a congressional power, but then the president is the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. So those are sort of thought of as shared powers. In general, what that means is that there is a broad swath of federal power that, if used, can overrule any state efforts to ally with other countries or make agreements with them. Now, that sounds like it would shut down a lot of California activities, but not so fast, I would say. So there are various ways in which the states can navigate around those kinds of restrictions, and also can benefit from certain kinds of constitutional immunities. So one thing that California has done, Karthik referred to the fact that states have created memoranda of understanding with other countries, right? Or that California has entered into memoranda of understanding. Those are thought of as kind of informal agreements that wouldn't rise to the level of a treaty, or that they wouldn't have the formality of something that would have to be authorized on the federal level. There are other kinds of constitutional abilities that states have. So the 10th and 11th Amendments of the Constitution basically reserve certain powers to the states, the 10th Amendment, and then in the 11th Amendment, there's a doctrine called state sovereign immunity. That means that states can't be sued for certain kinds of monetary damages. So I'll focus on the 10th Amendment in particular, because that's been a source for thinking about California's autonomy in the sanctuary cities context. So when we think about what federal governments can do, one limit derived from the 10th Amendment is that they can't commandeer state officers or commandeer state legislatures into enacting a federal plan. So they can't use state and local officials to implement federal laws, whether that's federal drug laws or federal immigration policy. So I think that 10th Amendment limitation is a very important one that gives California some space for acting in the international arena. Now, another thing that we might think about is the kind of explicit disabilities placed upon states based on the Constitution. So Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which Article 1 largely deals with Congress, but Section 10 puts some disabilities on the states and says explicitly that they can't enter into compacts without the consent of Congress. So that's there can be these agreements among states, and there are some compacts among states. There's a kind of prison transfer compact. There are some other compacts that are important, but it requires the consent of Congress, which is sometimes difficult to achieve. So when we're thinking about California acting with other states at a subnational level or with foreign governments, we have to think about kind of circumventing those kinds of constitutional constraints. The other thing that we might think about is Article 4 of the Constitution, which has a clause called the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which means that every a citizen of one state has to be entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizens of another state. So that means that California can't discriminate against out-of-state citizens, right? So there has to be a sort of reciprocity with interstate travel and the citizens of other states. And then there's a related doctrine called the Dormant Commerce Clause that's been an important limitation also on states, which really involves discriminating against out-of-state commerce, and it's been used in certain ways to limit environmental regulation or limit consumer protection kinds of regulations. But the general lesson here is that there are some formal constraints on what states can do, both based on the scope of federal powers under the Constitution and based on the kind of explicit limitations placed on states, but there are also some potentials and potentialities given by the 10th Amendment, by other kinds of restrictions on how much the federal government can impose on state power and state authority. So I think that California has really managed in a great way to navigate between the lines of the Constitution and effectuate a lot of change on a local and international level without running afoul of these constitutional constraints.
Great. Before I go to Tina, just one quick clarification question. On privileges and immunities, something like in-state tuition, that's something that is allowed, right? And I remember that especially immigration conservatives tried to oppose California's law, AB 540, which essentially says that regardless of if you have legal status in the United States, what rules in terms of getting in-state tuition and later financial aid that a U.S. citizen from another state is not entitled to is based on residency in the state of California. So at least it seems like that's not something that's been challenged effectively at all in the federal court system.
Well, there have been some challenges actually to in-state tuition, and there are a couple of law review articles that are suggesting that in-state tuition violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause. You're right that certainly it hasn't been struck down as it's been applied so far, but I would say that a lot of the states do keep in mind the Privileges and Immunities Clause when constructing their in-state tuition requirements, because they can't say you can never become an in-state resident, right? So most of the states basically allow someone to become a resident, including California, within a year after they've moved here. So they can charge out-of-state tuition for the first year, but then people, if they've established an intent to continue to live in the state, then are able to pay in-state tuition after that point. So there are these requirements of sort of duration of residency prior to obtaining certain rights, and the courts have kind of upheld those because they seem reasonable. But if it goes to, you have to live in California for 15 years before you can collect Medicaid benefits, then that would not be thought adequate. Yeah.
Great. Tina, you are a lawyer, you're a jurist par excellence, some might say, but I want to go beyond the law here, and in your initial remarks, as the president of Carnegie, and this choice of thinking about California as on par with the other offices that Carnegie has. What attracted Carnegie to establish this California office, and what does it say about the future of California as a foreign policy power?
Thank you, Karthik. I want to address that, but I want to just give a couple thank yous first. First to you and your colleagues at California 100. I think what you're doing is really exciting. I've watched it with interest. I'm happy to be supportive of it, what you're doing with Henry Brady and others. And also thank you to Mark Duggan for hosting us here at SIEPR. And a special thank you to all of you in the audience. I've been around a lot of conferences in my life, as you have, and there's always this gradual drop-off as you get to near the end of a conference. I remember actually when Bernie and I were assistant professors around back then, I attended a conference and I was on the last panel. It started at 9 a.m. There were about 80 or 90 people in the room, and every panel, like 20 people walked out. And I kept on doing the math, like how many people are going to be there in the end? And my own expectations were getting lower and lower. I kept on thinking like, okay, if there are 20 people, I'll be perfectly happy. If there are 10 people, in the end there were about 3 people. So I feel, when I look out at the audience and I see you all, I feel joy. I feel hope for the future of California, among other things. So how many of you were born in California? Raise your hand if you were born. How many of you feel like you are Californian? Okay, so I note that the two numbers don't overlap completely, and I just want to briefly start making my point about why an institution like the Carnegie Endowment belongs in California by noting that there has been a long question in the history of American life, which is sort of the backdrop for everything Bernie shared in terms of the legal scaffolding, which is a very helpful overview of constitutional law, which is like, what claim does a state have on us, on our loyalty? And particularly, let me just put a finer point on it. What claim does a state have on our loyalty post the Civil War, like post Robert E. Lee and all that stuff, and post the Civil Rights Movement, Jim Crow and all that, where if somebody stands up today and says like, I'm for states' rights, that's kind of loaded. That's like not a popular thing to say, and it's quickly complicated, and rightly so. Like anybody who says that should be challenged on, well, what do you feel about, minimum constitutional rights and due process, or do you really think the civil rights movement shouldn't apply in your state? And that should lead to a conversation. So in a way, everything I want to say in response to why is California a global power and why does California matter so much for the world, the backdrop is that even notwithstanding the real complexities and difficulties in our history of federalism, federalism is a fact, and it's a powerful one. And once you take that seriously, and then you layer on top of that the fact that this is not a big economy, but a giant economy, a staggeringly huge economy, larger than any economy in the world, save for 5 other countries, depending on how you count, it's inevitable that California will have to think globally, even if it didn't want to, even if it doesn't want to set up a foreign service or anything like that. Okay, so why?
One
So-
second.
Yeah.
You know, I think your jacket's rubbing against your mic.
It's a feature, not a bug. All right, let's see if this helps a little bit. Okay, so number one, California is really large and complex, but to pick up where the last panel left off, it also has something important that is not true for a lot of other big states in America, which is it has stable political majorities around some things. Now, I've been around California long enough to know that that has not always been the case. And it's not to say that we're not quite divided on issues like criminal justice even right now. But here's my, and you know, you all might differ a little bit, but I don't think you'll differ on the fact that there is a list of things that you could say 55% of Californians will reliably support this. Progressive taxation, a cosmopolitan orientation, a relative openness to immigration, direct democracy, like we don't want to get rid of that. Public investment, pretty robust public investment. We don't want the University of California to go away. Maybe we should cost less and, you know, admitted more Californians, but we don't want it to go away. Progressive environmental policy and tolerant of labor. Now, what that means globally is that means California is not constantly just fighting with itself about these really, really big issues, and it can think about its core global interests, and I'll come back to those in a moment. The second thing I want to say is that if you think to first approximation that most power is held by the federal government, you're wrong. You know, there is this Dormant Commerce Clause stuff, and there is the, you know, the Article 1 of the Constitution and all that. But what do I mean? I follow the money, and I don't want to trivialize the sheer power and scale of the federal government. But let me be deeply fiscal here, right? So if you take military spending out of the equation and social insurance and debt, what's left? Not a small chunk of change for the federal government. We're talking about basically spending in the realm of about $500 billion. But now let's put together all state and local spending and look at what that looks like. Again, leaving the military, debt service, and social insurance aside, you get closer to 1.9 trillion. And these are, I think, 2015 numbers. So like, to a first approximation, power fiscally to do the day-to-day stuff is at the state level. And it, you know, it's not a surprise when you think about who employs police, education, who controls land use, you know, who actually has to partner with the federal government to do anything on environment, occupational safety, et cetera. Okay, so next point is federalism. I would argue the bargain is extremely dynamic. It's not set in stone. That means the nature and structure of federalism now is different from 100 years ago. And to the extent that anybody says like, oh, this is the power of the federal government, this is the power of the states, I would argue that is constantly up for debate and discussion within a certain framework, right? Okay, very briefly, when I think about Carnegie and the issues that are important and interesting, then I think about the need to look at subnational jurisdictions. Not just California. I'm thinking like we have an office in Brussels, we have an office in New Delhi, we have an office in Beijing for the moment, although we'll have to maybe split it with Singapore. We don't have an office in Bangalore, for example. But if I want to understand the flows of what's happening in the world and why that matters and where the future is, I want to be thinking about what these subnational jurisdictions are doing. And there is no more important subnational jurisdiction than California. Now what, to a first approximation, this is my sketch, you can disagree with me, are California's core geopolitical interests. I would say number one, making globalization work. There is no modern California without globalization, without trade, without flows of data, without flows of foreign direct investment, without people coming and going, without all the international students at Stanford University, et cetera. And what will sustain that globalization will be domestic arrangements and policies that make globalization popular at a time when it is not. So how does that play out in California? But I would say if I'm thinking about California's geopolitical interests, I'm thinking, how can California help make globalization reasonably popular? Briefly, the next one is a sustainable planet. We have an amazing combination of a Mediterranean climate and massive energy demand coming from 40 million people. That is a recipe for massive wildfires and bad air quality if we don't deal with climate change. Of course, the problem is that even with an incredibly forward climate policy, we're rounding error in a world where Indonesia, Brazil, et cetera, doesn't get its act together with some support and help from advanced industrialized countries. The next aspect of this, I would say, is going to be a functioning American democracy. If you want to see California's geopolitical interests suffer, then think about what happens when the election is attempted to be stolen in 2024. And I wish that were a completely and totally hypothetical thing. But again, if I'm thinking about California's geopolitical interests, I'm asking myself, what can California do, as a deterrent even, to make it clear to anybody who tries to steal the federal election in 2024 that it's not like places like California, Washington State, Massachusetts, New York are just going to be like, oh, I guess the election was stolen. Too bad. We're just going to behave. I don't think so. Like, I think federalism is the shock absorber, but also the real safeguard in American democracy. And we ought to think hard about what those equilibria start to look like when it's disrupted. Let me just end with one last point, which is, what are the tools? What does California have at its disposal in a world of, you know, Article 1, Section 10 and sovereign immunities and so on? Well, the first approximation, I'd say, number one, budgets. So we invest in our public infrastructure of knowledge creation and so on. We have our own domestic California policy, which shapes the treatment of undocumented immigrants and the promotion of trade to some extent. And we have the ability to do quasi-diplomacy. We have the ability to have relationships with other parts of the world. And in particular, I'd say much of the constitutional doctrine, from my perspective, boils down to one thing, which is we're on very thin ice if we make agreements that have any legally binding quality. But who's to say that that has to be the agreements we make? The arrangements we have, for example, with Quebec on climate and cap and trade, they're all sort of coordination mechanisms that then allow a sort of signaling back and forth to align policy. And I think we have only barely scratched the surface of all that.
Wow. Okay. So we've learned about the constraints that we face, but that still leaves quite a bit of running room, right, in terms of what California can do. And some of the things, Tina, from what you said, I don't think necessarily cost a lot of money. I think they take courage, they take imagination, and with the kind of disruptions that we've seen, and I think especially the kinds of threats of authoritarianism and other kinds of institutional erosion at the federal level, maybe these calls will amplify over time. One of the things I want to kind of dig into a little bit more is this, I think you call it quasi-diplomacy, but the kind of soft power. And one of the things, when you talk about globalization, one example isn't far from here with Apple's headquarters. A typical iPhone is probably assembled with parts from many different countries around the world, but when you open it up, it still says designed by Apple in California. California is still that kind of idea, the kind of cultural power that comes with it. Henry Brady talked earlier in our first session in terms of Quebec, having kind of projecting its kind of cultural assets and interests across the world, probably more in like the Francophone parts of the world, and kind of building an international presence. So to both of you, and Bernie, we, in part of the research that we did, we'd seen that at the law school that you had, I don't know if it was a symposium or something, right, in terms of California and its foreign policy potential. Wondering if you can draw on some of the interesting things you found in that work that you can bring to this conversation in terms of if we wanted to get more imaginative, what are the kinds of things we can be doing, maybe we're doing already, but maybe that we should be doing more?
Yeah, well, so I think that in particular in and Tina already mentioned this, in the climate space, that California has really already begun to do amazing things and has, entered into these kind of quasi-diplomatic relationships with other countries. California showed up at the Paris Climate Accords. California and New York both have been really on the forefront of kind of leading international climate agreements without entering into these kind of formal, into the formal terms. And as Tina was mentioning, it's really about coordination and making agreements around coordination. Now, I also have been thinking a little bit about other areas in which California could be doing something similar. I feel like the environment is one where people have already been thinking a lot about how to further the international profile of California. But one area is with respect to pandemic response. I think that at the beginning of the pandemic, there were very interesting efforts to coordinate among the states on pandemic responses and best practices and all of these things. And I know that California, and especially a lot of counties, have kept really incredible statistics on different measures that were undertaken. And I think that coordinating with some other countries to really dig into some of that data and figure out exactly the efficacy of masks versus other measures, or quarantining, all of these other things, I think would be really a service and would also help California kind of lead in a science-based way to maybe a less divided America on that front. And one other thought I have is also that in the policing area, California could be cooperating with other countries that are innovating in policing and thinking about, as we think about reforms to policing, try to do that within an international framework. There's increasing work on sort of policing across different countries, and I think drawing on that and trying to coordinate with people in those other geographical areas to see what happens when you have police officers without guns, what happens, all of those different things would help.
One thing you talked about earlier, Bernie, was this, I believe you called Interstate Compacts, right? And I'm wondering if you can say a bit more, because I think we saw attempts at that, and I think it's at least on water, I think there are some of these interstate compacts, right, at play. But I'm wondering, pandemic response was an attempt. I think it kind of fell apart a little bit, just given the nature of COVID. It wasn't something that it was a constantly dynamic situation, if we can, if that makes sense. But I'm wondering if there's other kinds of compacts. I mean, there's some related to clean air where the California standard is something that a bunch of other states can adopt, given the federal waiver. Are there other issues where, I mean, I think you said that as long as Congress has not explicitly said no, that states can enter into some of these compacts. I'm just wondering if there are potential innovations in other areas that we can think of.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that, so they can't enter into a formal compact unless Congress authorizes it, but Congress has authorized that on some occasions. I mean, obviously it's politically difficult in light of the fact that it's hard to get Congress to do anything to get something like that authorized, but there have been certain moments when Congress has authorized a compact, and that might be one thing to pursue. I think some people feel that it would be good to try to pursue more formal compacts because that would get around some of what Tina was referring to in terms of just having kind of coordination agreements. A formal compact would maybe have other consequences and repercussions if someone did not go along with it. But I think we could have compacts on policing. That would be another area where there might be an effort to sort of join forces and think about best practices regionally. And this sort of brings in another concept constitutionally that is relevant to the federalism question, which is just that there are certain things that historically have been thought to be part of the police powers of a state. And that doesn't mean the actual police really, but it means the power over the kind of health and safety and morals of a particular region. And that has included traditionally education, healthcare, all of those kinds of things, as well as the actual police. And so I think in those kinds of areas, it would be interesting to try to create more interstate compacts. Those are areas that even the Supreme Court says are generally areas that are left to state control. But if states entered into a compact, they might be able to kind of band together regionally. I mean, it would be interesting even to think about interstate compacts regarding abortion rights or the right to choose.
That's right, and gun control potentially too, although I doubt that Congress would give that authority to create an interstate compact. Although it's kind of emerging in some informal ways, right, in terms of different patterns of state regulation. We're going to have, so the next two questions, and I think, Tina, I'll just tee this up and we'll go to the audience. Some small steps that we can take right away, to kind of advance this notion of California as a foreign policy power. And then maybe some of the bigger long-term things that we should be aiming for, including potential changes to our national laws to give California the kind of running room to continue to innovate.
Yeah, no, terrific. First, just one quick comment on the point about interstate compacts. So it is an important limitation that Congress has to authorize these, but the devil's in the details, like what counts as an interstate compact. So again, I would just note, policy coordination, governors and legislatures saying, like, we're going to align policy, like woe be it to the court that then tries to sort of define interstate compacts so broadly that it tries to mess with that sort of thing. And that, I'm sure we'll come back to this point because apropos of like legal changes, like one thing that's really interesting about our legal system is it's got play in the joints. It's meant to be a little bit flexible. That's become all the more important in a world where Congress is not constantly passing laws because we're extremely polarized and there are all kinds of other structural reasons why we've got these veto gates. So like the play in the joints is so crucial to the future of California in the global stage. Frankly, also future to the prosperity of American federalism, because like the right way to really engender a lot of unnecessary frustration, anger, backlash is to so strictly interpret constitutional and statutory requirements that limit state experimentation to really drive this underground or to make it like a hot potato politically. Briefly on what we can do right now. I think California has a degree of collaboration and connection, especially to countries that are highly advanced and industrialized for the most part, plus China, let's say. Maybe to some extent India, but like the informal connections, the scientific collaborations, the international agreements, they're with places like Canada, Germany, China to some extent. But the future of like whether we scrape by on climate or not, to a first approximation, runs through like South Africa and Indonesia and Brazil. So I'd be asking myself right now, like, how can we much more deeply develop that textured knowledge of these places, the networks, the contacts, have people from those countries here at our universities and so on. I think the much bigger issue lurking in the background is that the world outside of California and then inside of California together face a defining problem, which is a staggering degree of inequality and economic uncertainty for a large chunk of people. And that's not to say that it's all terrible, right? Like Raj Chetty talks about the degree of economic mobility in the big dynamic metro areas in California and Washington State and a couple of other places. So that's really cool. Like, how do we do that? I don't think we even fully understand that. But you go over the mountains on the 152 and into Fresno, and it doesn't matter what you point to. It's air quality, it's wages, it's land use, it's accessibility of parks. And it's not a pretty picture. And people in this building study that to some extent. So I think that is a nice an apt metaphor for the rest of the world. And those divides, I think, to go back to the sort of like making the world safe for globalization, like how does California get leverage on helping the world deal with those divides?
Love this idea of thinking about California diplomatic core in sub-Saharan Africa and so many other parts of the world. By the way, if we think ahead towards 2100, the third largest country by population is no longer the United States. It's not a country like Brazil that you might think of, but Nigeria. How many Californians, how many people in the US are thinking about immigrants from Nigeria or foreign policy interests or business interests in Nigeria? We should be thinking about that in terms of these long-term goals. Bernie, some final thoughts before we go to the audience.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear other questions, so I'm...
Okay, so let's open it up to the audience in terms of questions you have. So we have a question in the front, and then we'll go to Frank in the back. If you could identify yourself before asking the question.
Yeah, I'm Diego. I'm a junior here at Stanford. And my question is, it seems like really what we're talking about is federalism, like not to distract too much from the question of foreign policy, but my question is, like, what kind of leverage does California as a state have and as the economic power that we are against the federal government in the event of a hostile takeover, or what kind of tools can we use to leverage our power and authority in that scenario?
Great question. You want to start? Okay, so I think let's go back to the Civil War. it's clear that the Civil War settled one thing which is important, and we should not lose sight of it, which is one kind of leverage that states thought they had pre-Civil War we don't have now, and that is just to secede, to say, like, we want out of the Union, and it doesn't matter whether you think the rest of the Union, or if the rest of the Union thinks that's a good idea or not. But let's think a little bit about what leverage that does leave the states. It's important to recognize that all states have a degree of police power, as Bernie was talking about, that is not subject to complete squelching by the federal government. Federal government has to take indirect routes to stop states from doing things like arguing that something is connected to interstate commerce. That means that whenever there is some potential point of contention between the state and the federal government, there are legal arguments that are going to be on both sides. And just as the U.S. Senate, let's just pick a wonderfully functional institution, has these norms, right, that partly reflect folk wisdom passed along from one generation to another that allow business to be transacted, and those norms have declined, and now the Senate doesn't get as much done. There are kind of certain norms that structure the relationship between the federal government and the states right now, post-Civil War, and some of those are not everything that could end up in court goes to court, honestly. Like, you know, when an adversarial and very ambitious state attorney general is taking on the federal government, there's still some degree of restraint. You don't, like, flood the courts, state and federal, by the way, with every possible impediment to what the federal government is doing. It would be a very different world when states felt that it was actually morally legitimate to do that. Red states and blue states. I think it would be very, very hard to get a straight legal answer about who's right. The second really big thing that states could do is, this goes back a little bit to the fiscal picture I painted, where again, if you take out social insurance and all that stuff, when the federal government spends money to do stuff in education and occupational safety and environment, it runs through cooperation with state agencies. And it's strategically tricky, but states could say, you know, we're out. Everything you want to do, federal government, we're doing zero of that. So think sanctuary cities around immigration, but to an extreme across every possible issue. Now, you might say, as a matter of game theory, well, in many cases, what the states and the federal government are doing are advancing policies that states care about, like environmental policies. But it may be that in certain states of the world politically, it's actually more important to the state to say, we're just like going to stop the federal government from doing anything. And then from there are more dramatic things I could imagine, but just for starters, I would say those two things, plus an engaged leadership at the state level, calling on citizens to question their own sense of allegiance and not quite allegiance, but their sense that all is well with the federal government would be highly disruptive.
So quick follow-up on that, Tina, is could we see maybe an unlikely alliance in the long-term future, not thinking about 24 or 28, of states like California facing a federal government and federal agencies that have gotten so highly politicized or just weakened in various ways, to say, let's just reduce federal taxes and then shift the locus of service provision to states. And especially for a net donor state like California, like, why not?
I've seen stranger coalitions politically, and if you want to see what the vote totals would look like, look at the pro-trade coalitions in the Clinton administration. I mean, just let me flesh it out, because this is important, right? Part of what sustains the equilibrium of the federal government right now is a willingness of states that believe in high taxation, both state and federal, to continue supporting that with their own congressional delegations. And, you know, we could do the math and see how exactly politics shakes out, who controls the Senate and all that stuff. But could I imagine a coalition of states that believe in low taxation as a general matter and states that believe in low taxation as a federal matter as they increasingly become disenchanted with the federal government? Absolutely, I can. Yes. You know, would that be good for the country? I don't think so. I'm not sure it would be. But I'm trying to be very descriptive here. I'm not giving you kind of a moral judgment. I'm just trying to think about the raw politics of federalism in ways that I think people don't fully appreciate.
I think that I absolutely agree with all of what you've laid out. And I just want to sort of give another example, I think, of where this federalism balance we already see shifting in the direction of the states, and that's with respect to the legalization of marijuana. And so, you know, even if the federal government wanted to try to impose federal law or impose federal policing, in the distribution of marijuana, it would be just logistically impossible given the number of federal officers as opposed to state officers and the scope of, kind of the marijuana business in California and other states. So once you sort of see that, you realize how much is actually a matter of bureaucracy, right? So that if you don't have the bureaucracy within the state, then you're not going to be able to implement various kinds of federal programs. And I think that actually one effect, and Karthik mentioned sort of, a kind of weakening of administrative agencies or weakening of the administrative state. Certainly that's been going on under the current Supreme Court's pressure on administrative agencies and restrictions on administrative agencies, but I think that that actually leaves an opening for state administration and state administrative activity. So to the extent that the federal government is being pulled back, maybe in some states there won't be anything to replace it, but I think that we might see an increasing vibrancy of state-level administrative operations in the absence of a kind of federal body to trump them.
Before we go to Frank Fukuyama, I just want to kind of lift up one aspect, what Tino, you talked about in terms of increasing international exchange, like getting back to foreign policy. I know we just did a quick dive into federalism, but going back to foreign policy, one of the things in our immigrant integration report that Manuel Pastor and team thought seriously about is, might we see a kind of progressive version of nativism? Arguably, we're already seeing that. So the state legislature wants to see fewer international students in the University of California system, I think for a good reason, saying that we need to provide access to the people of California. But potentially we run a risk of weakening some of those international connections and even future migration streams into California. So is that something we should be thinking about? I'm also just thinking about like international exchange programs. I mean, Tina, I don't know if this could be part of the future for Carnegie in California to promote more international exchange, certainly among academic institutions, but maybe beyond that as well. So I just don't know if you can just say a bit more about that.
Sure, I think it's a really interesting point. I don't begrudge the California voters sitting somewhere at Riverside or in Humboldt County or in LA saying like, well, my labor and my revenue is sort of paying for this complex system, and I increasingly feel like my kids don't have a shot at going to a UC campus. So I take that very seriously. Like, I think at the end of the day, one really key part of what Bernie and I are talking about that is worth making explicit is, I talked about a world safe for globalization. Well, that's true here domestically too. So I'd be thinking like, what's the right balance between international and in-state students to keep California and the UC system in particular a vibrant hub for global advancement, not just of ideas, but of like people who are going to go change the world all over the world. That said, I do think that taking a step back and thinking about what California is best positioned to do for the world cannot be done without a robust capacity to expose people from all over the world to what we do well in California. And to be clear, like apropos of the last panel, plenty of things we can talk about that we don't do well, including unemployment insurance. But there are some things we do well, and I think that the world California wants to be in is one where we're able to share that with the rest of the world.
Great. Frank, over to you.
Question for Tino. You said that if there's an attempt to steal the 24 election, that California wouldn't have to sit idly by. Could you elaborate on what there was an attempt by these red state attorney generals to contest the last election, right, that led by Texas, that, I don't know, didn't really get standing. But what exactly could California do because I presume this would be efforts at a state level in swing states to overturn a legitimate election? What did you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. I think it basically runs through my answer to the previous question about like what the state's levers are when it comes to its relations with the federal government. And I think, we could go back to the contested elections in the late 19th century, like 1876 and so on, around real uncharted waters. But I would start with the premise that we're not yet at a point in history, I feel like, where there's such a degree of disinformation and such a degree of complete subjectivity about what really happened, that there's just like no truth. We're on the way there, perhaps, and that's a separate conversation of what can we do to stop that. But I don't think we'll get to that in 2024. So one scenario that I would just put out there just to think about as a thought experiment is one where it's relatively clear who won the Electoral College, relatively clear. There might be a little dispute in this or that state, but it's not material to the total electoral vote. But the candidate that wins is from a party that does not control Congress. And the party that does control Congress views an opportunity to read the Electoral Count Act, which in 2024 may or may not be reformed, with enough loopholes and ambiguities to say we're just going to work together with some states, including states that elected this candidate seems to have won and sent electoral votes there, and we're going to try to create ambiguity about what the right electoral slates are. We're just going to do that. Then we're going to have a quick vote on the floor of the House of Representatives, and it's going to be done, and we're going to pick the president. So now I go to the next part of the game tree, and I'm thinking, like, what is the governor, the popular governor of a state like New York, like Washington State, like California, going to do in a situation like that? It's actually pretty clear the election was stolen. And I just don't think that the answer is going to be, well, that governor is going to give an Al Gore-like speech, and then it's going to be done. Instead, I think some of these levers involving pervasive lawsuits might be at issue, and not just about elections. There might be public speeches saying, like, to all of you citizens of this particular state, if you think that what just happened is bad, and it's pretty clear that it was unlawful, then, you know, some kind of resistance to that. Civil disobedience is appropriate. Like, what does that look like? Does that take place in and around federal lands in those states? Does it take the form of congressional delegations behaving very differently? Does it take the form of resistance to paying taxes? Like, I don't love those scenarios, but I'm just thinking, if anyone believes that the election can actually be stolen because of some loopholes in the Electoral Count Act, and it won't reverberate at the federalism level, we're going to see a lot more than lawsuits to try to, you know, make a rival argument about who won the electoral vote in a particular state. It'll be much bigger than that.
So in a nutshell, then, strategic to potentially escalating non-cooperation are the tools that...
Yeah, and I would say I'm making a descriptive argument here, okay? So we can have a separate discussion about the morality and ethics of what do people do to protect democracy when the chips are down. But I'm just saying, like, let's follow the politics here. Like, why would it, like, I would just shift the burden of persuasion to somebody who says, no, people just accept that. And life would go on, they'd just, like, mourn democracy a little bit. Like, I don't see that. Like, I think actually that's quite core to why federalism is with us, right? So that's my starting point, and it all goes back to foreign policy too at some level, because you better believe that that drama will be watched not by just hundreds of millions in the U.S., but by billions around the world, including in a lot of countries that don't always align policy-wise with the U.S.
So I'll ask the final question to both of you, and this will come back to a kind of version of a federalism question. And I'll say, both as moderator's privilege and as a co-author of a book, where we have state rights in the subtitle, Tino, not in the title, but this notion of state citizenship. Instead of progressives especially, and maybe even conservatives, wanting to win everything, and also taking into account this kind of pendulum swing, you know, maybe the peak of federal power was, you know, the war on poverty. Since then, it's been kind of swinging back, and it seems to be accelerating, especially with various rights, voting rights, reproductive rights, trans rights, so many rights now no longer being guaranteed, potentially no longer being guaranteed at the federal level. Should we learn to stop worrying and embracing federalism to serve our purpose? And what might be the cost of doing that, but what might be the cost of inaction if we just continue to pin our hopes at a federal solution that seems less and less viable? So either, yeah, go ahead. Do you want to start, Bernie?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think that's a great question, and thanks for asking that. My inclination is to want to expand a kind of federalist solution and expand state activity on all of these fronts and on the rights protection front. And certainly, I think it's been an interesting sort of evolution with, we were just talking before the panel about state constitutional law as opposed to federal constitutional law. A lot of states used to kind of couple their interpretation of their own constitution with the federal constitution, but I think there's been a progressive decoupling and much more insistence on state constitutional rights, even if they look like they're similar to federal constitutional rights, being more robust and more protective in a lot of contexts. So my inclination is sort of in that direction, but I have to say that I do think that then we start living in a more and more shrinking country, and where, especially if there's really this disparity of rights across America, you can imagine, well, what if your plane accidentally lands somewhere, in Texas, and you've been flying from California to New York, and you need to access a particular right, are you going to be basically acting as though you're in another country at that point, and not being able to enjoy the same privileges as you would in your
By the way,
home
some
state?
conference goers I know for professional associations worry about what happens when they step out of their hotel conference rooms in terms of the rights that they or their partners might have, in terms of healthcare, for example. So that is a worry, so we should worry about that. We should be very, okay, Tina.
Yeah, just picking up on that. Look, it's a big and complicated country, and sitting here in California, we have things to learn from Texas, and Massachusetts has things to learn from Florida. But I don't think anybody has any choice if they care about key policy issues that we've talked about in different ways in this conference, around sustainability and climate, around fiscal responsibility, around America's place in the world, around our ability to meet the needs of kids that are growing up in a very unequal society. Like, all those things run massively through federalism, and I think anybody who always felt like the federal government, either fiscally or legally, was just going to be the backstop to be able to guarantee success, whether you're in Mississippi or Oklahoma or California, I don't think that was ever entirely realistic. I do hope that there is a core of national citizenship that we hang on to, and I think as people think about a dangerous world, about Russia, about our growing tensions with China, I hope that they do not lose some belief in national citizenship. I just think that that will not bear everything we ask of it, maybe, and that means we need to think seriously about what's happening in places like this.
Well, thank you so much for, I think what is safe to say is the beginnings of a series of important conversations we need to have as a state, as a country, as a society, in terms of solving collective challenges that we face, but also to not have our innovative energies and capacities stifled with some of the strictures that we have, and to be able to imagine a different future and to enact some of those changes that we wish to see. Thank you, everyone, for joining us both here and remotely. And Mark, we have first of all, just thank you so much to Mark and the entire SIEPR team. I also want to give a shout out to the California 100 team members and other commissioners in the audience as well. We have a brief reception now that people can join us outside. Great.